On October 10, 2025, while world leaders declared a new ceasefire between Israel and the group surrounding it on all sides, cameras showed crowds celebrating, headlines speaking of historic peace, political agreements being signed, and promises of reconstruction being announced. Let me explain what just happened because it is profoundly prophetic. While the planet celebrates yet another human document promising security, the Word of God describes this very scenario as the perfect climate for the greatest deception in history. And what few realize is that, amidst all this talk of peace and security in the Middle East, Jesus has already given a specific instruction on what to do in the first 24 hours of the darkest period the world will ever see. Now here's where it gets shocking. When many think about the Great Tribulation, they imagine fasting, prayer, spiritual endurance, underground churches, courageous martyrs. But when Jesus spoke directly about that time, he didn't begin by talking about praying more, or preaching more, or organizing large evangelistic campaigns. He gave a command that seems almost cowardly. He said, "Flee." In Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, Jesus declares that when the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel is seen standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Immediately afterward, he commands those who are in Judea to flee to the mountains. Let me explain what this means, because it is here that the first prophetic revelation unfolds before us. Discovery 1. Jesus' first command during the Great Tribulation is not to fight, but to obey by fleeing. This challenges everything we imagine about courageous faith. We associate faith with persevering, facing challenges, enduring to the end, standing firm in the face of pressure. But observe carefully what happens next in Christ's words. He says that whoever is on the roof should not go down to get anything from the house, and whoever is in the field should not return to get their cloak. In other words, no suitcase, no documents, no money, no lingering farewells. So here's the question. Why would the Lord himself, who has called so many to martyrdom throughout history, order immediate flight at this specific moment? What changes in the spiritual and political landscape that makes obedience outwardly appear as cowardice? To understand this, we need to go back to the prophet Daniel. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, we read about a covenant that is established for a prophetic week. And in the middle of that week, the sacrifice and offerings cease, and something called abomination is raised up, bringing desolation. Let me explain what this means. The Hebrew word translated as abomination is shikkutz. If you have never studied this word before, you are about to have your understanding reshaped. Shikkutz does not describe any generic sin. It speaks of something repulsive in the eyes of God, linked to extreme idolatry, to a cult that profanes what is holy. The idea of desolation, on the other hand, comes from a root that points to devastation, emptiness, total ruin. So when Daniel speaks of the abomination of desolation, he is not talking about a bad feeling nor a vague spiritual metaphor. He is describing a specific act of ultimate idolatry, placed at the center of what is holy, which brings a wave of devastation on a historical scale. Now, this is where it gets very specifically prophetic. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul takes this scenario and applies it to a concrete figure. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, he speaks of the man of sin, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, to the point of sitting in the temple of God, wanting to appear as God. Do you see the layer of evidence? First, textual evidence. Daniel speaks of abomination in the holy place. Second, apostolic evidence. Paul describes a man sitting in the temple claiming to be God. Third, prophetic evidence from Jesus. He points to that very moment and says, "When you see this, run away." But here's what you need to understand. Jesus isn't describing just any ordinary persecution. Throughout 2,000 years of church history, countless believers have died for standing firm where they were. The command to flee was never the general rule. So why now? Because according to Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 24, verse 21, from that event begins a great tribulation such as has not been since the beginning of the world, nor ever shall be. In other words, this is not just another cycle of persecution. It is the culmination of human rebellion against God, combined with the maximum political, religious, and technological power that the Antichrist's system can muster. Wait a moment and observe this. If Jesus links the order to flee to a political and religious event in the temple, we are not talking only about feelings of fear or social pressures. We are talking about a public act, broadcast, celebrated, imposed, that inaugurates a phase of absolute control. Now you might be thinking, but is this literal? Will there really be a temple, a world leader, a visible act of blasphemy? Valid point. Many Christians throughout the centuries have interpreted these texts symbolically, but here's what makes this moment different. For the first time in history, we have a Jewish people restored to their land, Jerusalem once again under Israeli control, real movements speaking of rebuilding the temple, and a geopolitical scenario in which peace treaties are used as spiritual and political bargaining chips. I am not making definitive prophetic identifications, nor am I saying that any current leader is the Antichrist. But the convergence of factors shows that the structure that Daniel, Jesus, and Paul describe is becoming plausible before our very eyes. Consider the facts: peace treaties, technological advancements, religious tensions, a city that is the spiritual epicenter of the world. The evidence of a pattern is at the very least intriguing. So here's the question that runs through everything. If Jesus already said exactly what to do when this event happens, why do we almost never hear a sermon explaining this command clearly? Why do we talk so much about being ready, but so little about obeying by fleeing when the appointed sign arrives? Because touching on this point stirs something deep within us. We like the idea of being spiritual heroes who stay until the end, but we struggle with the image of leaving everything behind in obedience. Yet that is exactly what Jesus commanded for the first hours after the abomination of desolation, and understanding the reason for this urgency is the next step in our journey when we begin to look not only at the commandment to flee, but at what lies behind this radical and rarely preached order. When Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24, verse 16, "Those who are in Judea flee to the mountains," he is not making a generic emotional appeal. He is describing a timed response, meticulously linked to a specific prophetic event. And here comes our second discovery. The first 24 hours after the abomination of desolation will be the most decisive window in human history for anyone alive at that moment. Let me explain what this means, because it is profoundly critical. Throughout biblical history, God has always created windows of opportunity. In Noah's day, there was a period to enter the ark. In Lot's day, there was a time to leave Sodom. In Exodus, there was a night marked by the blood of the Lamb on the doorposts. After the door closes, after the city is destroyed, after the angel passes, the opportunity ends. Similarly, when the man of sin sits in the temple as if he were God, Jesus describes an urgency that does not appear anywhere else in his ministry. Let him who is on the housetop not come down, and let him who is in the field not turn back. In other words, do not negotiate with time, because time has ceased to be your ally. Now, here's where it gets specific and prophetic. The Greek word used for flee is phugo. If you've never paid attention to this word, pay attention now. Phugo doesn't just mean to leave slowly. It carries the idea of escaping, of running from imminent danger like someone fleeing a city about to be invaded. It's the flight of someone who understands that every second counts. So here's the question. If Jesus uses such a strong verb, why do we almost always treat this passage as if it were just another text about being attentive to the end times? He didn't say reflect. He didn't say consider. He said flee. Furthermore, he specified the destination, to the mountains. This leads us to another layer of our prophetic investigation. When we arrive at the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 6, we read about a woman who flees to the desert, to a place prepared by God, where she is sustained for 1,260 days. Let me explain what this means. First, textual evidence. Jesus speaks of fleeing to the mountains. John speaks of fleeing to the desert. Both connect escape and protection in a time of extreme distress. Second, linguistic evidence. The Greek word for desert in Revelation chapter 12 is eremos. It doesn't just mean sand and heat. It speaks of a solitary, remote, sparsely populated place. a space where God takes his people out of the center of the system to deal with them directly. Third, historical evidence. Throughout the Bible, the desert is the setting for deliverance and training. Israel is taken out of Egypt to the wilderness. Elijah is preserved in the wilderness. John the Baptist emerges from the wilderness. Jesus is strengthened in the wilderness. The pattern is clear. What the world calls isolation, God calls preparation and protection. But here's what you need to understand. In Revelation, the desert ceases to be merely a metaphor and also becomes geography. John says there is a place prepared. Time has passed. Already ready. This means that at this very moment, somewhere on the map, there is a real concrete territory that God has already set apart as a refuge for this period. Now you might be thinking, but isn't that an exaggeration? Wouldn't it be better to interpret everything symbolically, as if the desert were merely an image of God's presence? Valid point. Many serious scholars see profound symbolism in this passage. I'm not denying the symbolism. What I'm suggesting is that biblically, God has a habit of using real places to tell real spiritual stories. The Red Sea was real. Mount Sinai was real. The Jezreel Valley is real. So, whether this moment represents the literal fulfillment of the flight to the desert or a remarkable preview of a pattern that God will repeat, every believer should, at the very least, observe, pray, and prepare. Not with fear, but with understanding. Carefully observe what happens when we put the pieces together. Jesus points to a political and religious event in Jerusalem. Paul identifies a man who claims to be God inside the temple. John describes a people fleeing to a pre-prepared place, sustained for a specific period of time. Most people see these texts as separate blocks, almost as if they were different stories. But when you read them in sequence, you realize they form a prophetic map. Not a map for intellectual curiosity, but a map for practical obedience. And here comes discovery number 3, which we will begin to unpack. God not only commands flight, he also promises provision in the place to which he commands fleeing. He never calls someone to leave a system without having already prepared an environment where that person will be sustained. This is how it was with Abraham leaving Ur, with Israel leaving Egypt, with the church being called out of the world, and it will be the same in this final moment. So here's the question I want to leave lingering in your heart, and that I'd like you to think about sincerely. If you knew that, in less than a day, everything stable in your life would be shaken, what would be harder to give up in obedience to Jesus? Your possessions, your security, or the opinions of those around you? When we talk about Jesus' command to flee, many only imagine the physical act of running. But Discovery 3 shows us that this flight is not simply geographical, it is spiritual. And to understand this deeply, we need to return to Jesus' prophetic discourse and observe something that almost no one notices. Notice how he constructs a line of reasoning in Matthew chapter 24. First, he describes wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, deceptions, persecutions. Then he says that all this is the beginning of sorrows. That is, it is not the end, but the beginning. Then he moves on to a distinct, unique, unrepeatable moment, the entry of the man of sin into the holy place. Only then does he give a direct command, flee. Let me explain what this means. Jesus is distinguishing between two types of suffering, the suffering of the world and the suffering of the kingdom of darkness. The first has always existed. The second only fully manifests itself when the Antichrist reveals his true identity. While events are still in the beginning of sorrows phase, Jesus doesn't tell anyone to flee. But when the abomination appears, he says, now. And here's where it gets profoundly prophetic. This order marks the boundary between two kingdoms. Before it, the church remains in the world while the gospel is proclaimed, lives are transformed, and grace expands. After it, a phase begins in which remaining in the system can cost one's soul. Not just physical life, but eternity. So here's the question. Why does fleeing become such a serious spiritual issue at this point? Because, according to Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 through 18, whoever remains under the system will be pressured to receive a mark, and whoever receives it loses not only freedom but salvation. The mark is not just economics, it's worship, it's surrender, it's forced worship of the enemy. Now observe carefully what happens when we connect this to the prophecy in Revelation chapter 12. John sees the woman fleeing to the desert, not as someone seeking a makeshift hiding place, but as someone going to a prepared place. The expression prepared place in Greek is topon etoimasmenon. Topon means physical space. Etoimasmenon means something arranged, previously disposed. In other words, God does not improvise refuges. He builds refuges. And here's something that almost no one discusses. Fleeing is not just an act of survival, but an act of trust. Fleeing to a place you didn't prepare requires radical faith. It's the same pattern we see in Abraham, when God calls him to go to a land he didn't know. It's the same pattern of the people of Israel, who leave Egypt without a defined route, guided only by the cloud. It's the same pattern of Elijah going to Cherith, without knowing how he would be sustained. Now you might be thinking, but why would God lead his people back to the desert, an arid place without resources? Valid point, but here's what you need to understand. In God's logic, the desert was never abandonment. The desert is the space where all false dependence is broken. It's where we learn that bread doesn't come from the market, but from God's hand. It's where we discover that water doesn't come from systems, but from the rock. It's where we stop trusting in human structures and begin to trust in the God who guides and sustains. And observe this. If the Great Tribulation will be the moment of maximum intensity of deception, the desert will be the moment of maximum intensity of revelation. While the world worships the image of the beast, those who flee will see daily miracles. While the economic system collapses, those who are in the prepared place will have guaranteed sustenance for 1,260 days. While the world lives in spiritual terror, the desert will be the place where God reveals himself as provider, guardian, and constant presence. But here's a layer that many ignore. Flight also functions as separation. Throughout the Bible, God separates his people before acts of judgment. In the flood, he separates Noah. In Sodom, he separates Lot. In Egypt, he separates Goshen. On the cross, he separates those who believe, and at the end of time, he will separate those who obey the voice of the Lamb. So here is the prophetic and practical question. When Jesus says, flee, what is he calling you away from? Just a physical place, or from everything that binds your soul to the world system? Because physical escape will be impossible for those who haven't first learned to flee spiritually from attachment to fleeting things. Now let me anticipate something many people wonder about. But does a physical place prepared by God really exist? I'm not making absolute claims. What I'm saying is that Revelation chapter 12 literally speaks of a specific place where the people will be sustained. Whether this represents the final fulfillment or an anticipated pattern, we should observe, pray, and keep our hearts alert. And there's a detail that makes it all the more intriguing. Nothing describes a natural, protected, mountainous, and difficult-to-invade refuge, as well as certain regions that have been cited by scholars over the decades. We are not establishing dogmas, but analyzing prophetic, historical, and geographical patterns. That being said, before we move on to Discovery 4 and analyze how this prepared place connects to biblical geography, allow me to ask a subtle but important question. If this content is sparking your biblical understanding and bringing clarity to topics that many avoid, why not subscribe to the channel to continue following in-depth studies like this one? This helps you not miss the next chapters of this journey and strengthens the community of people who want to understand the scriptures seriously. To understand Discovery number 4, we need to look at a point that, for centuries, has been before the eyes of humanity, but few have perceived its prophetic depth. If God truly prepared a place in the desert to sustain his people for 1,260 days, then that place is not arbitrary. It must fulfill 3 biblical requirements: difficult access, natural protection, and the capacity to sustain life for a long period. And when we observe the geography around Israel, only one region seems to impressively combine all these characteristics. But before revealing what this means, let me explain why this point is so critical. When Jesus commands immediate flight, he assumes that the people will not have time to choose where to go. This shows that destiny does not depend on human wisdom at that moment, but on a prior divine preparation. The question is not, where do I think I should flee, but Where has God already prepared for me to go? And this is where the analysis of Revelation chapter 12 gains strength. John describes that the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle to fly to the desert, to her place. Not just any place, not a makeshift shelter, but her place. This detail changes everything. It means that there is a geographical point marked on the map of prophetic history, a place that combines isolation with preservation, surrounding danger with internal security. Now observe this carefully. Throughout the Bible, God uses geographical elements as instruments of protection. In the Exodus from Egypt, he parted the Red Sea and transformed it into walls. At Horeb, he used steep mountains as a refuge. At En-Gedi, caves served as a hiding place for David. If God acts consistently, it would not be surprising that the final place of prophetic protection was also formed by rocks, mountains, and narrow passages. And here we begin to see a very specific image emerge. In regions east of Israel, there is a natural labyrinth of rocks sculpted by time, corridors so narrow that only 2 people can pass side by side, cliffs so high that they block direct sunlight for hours of the day. There is natural water gushing from fissures, ancient caves, and sculpted structures that can shelter multitudes. You might be thinking, but isn't that a geographical coincidence? Valid point. But here's what you need to understand. Throughout the centuries, Jewish scholars, Christians, and historians have noted that certain regions seem almost molded by the very hand of God, like natural fortresses. We are not making definitive statements here, nor identifying one location as the only possible one. What we are doing is observing patterns, connections, and signs that appear repeatedly. Now let me explain why this prophetic refuge is not merely physical, but symbolic. In the desert, God removes his people from the sphere of human power and places them under his direct care. While the beast system controls commerce, water, energy, communication, and surveillance, those who are in the prepared place will be completely outside of that cycle. This is not just physical protection, it is spiritual disconnection from the world. It is as if God was saying, I will set them apart for myself, just as I did in the Exodus. And observe this carefully, because it is profoundly revealing. When John says that the woman will be sustained, the word used carries the idea of continuous maintenance. That is, there will be no random moments of miracle. It will be constancy, rhythm, daily provision. Just as the manna fell every morning, just as the ravens fed Elijah every day, just as the widow of Zarephath never lacked flour and oil, so too will the people in the desert be sustained, so that no day will be lacking. Now you might be thinking, but how exactly will God do this? Where will the water come from? Where will the food come from? How will there be protection against modern military forces? Valid point. But again, consider the biblical pattern. When God calls someone to a prepared place, he has already taken care of the conditions beforehand. When he called Israel to the desert, there was already water gushing from the rock. When he called Elijah to the brook Cherith, there were already ravens trained by divine will. When he called Abraham to Canaan, there was already an altar waiting to be built. What few realize is that, in the Great Tribulation, the miracle will not be the existence of provision, but its constancy, even when the world is collapsing. And this constancy is what God often uses to strengthen the faith of those who will be living witnesses of his faithfulness. But there is something even deeper. The desert will be the place where God will definitively break the attachment to human structures. There, without cities, without systems, without comfort, without technology, he will teach again what he has always taught. I am your God, and I take care of you. And before we move on to Discovery 5, where we'll begin connecting this prepared place with clues left by the Old Testament prophets, allow me to ask something simple and sincere. If this content has brought clarity, depth, and biblical understanding to you, please click like. This helps spread this study to more people who are seriously seeking to understand the Scriptures and further strengthens this journey we are building together. Discovery number 5 begins to take shape when we realize that the Old Testament prophets repeatedly spoke of a place of refuge linked to the last days. Not explicitly, not with maps or coordinates, but with images, metaphors, and geographical descriptions that when placed side by side form a coherent picture. And when we carefully analyze these clues, something fascinating emerges. A territorial pattern pointing to a specific region east of Israel, marked by mountains, rocks, and narrow passages. Let me explain what this means, because it is profoundly significant. In Isaiah chapter 16, verse 4, we find an intriguing phrase, "Let my exiles dwell with you, O Moab, be a hiding place for them from the destroyer." The word hiding place here in Hebrew is setter, which speaks of a hidden, protected place, inaccessible to the enemy. Isaiah is describing a refuge situated in Moabite territory, that is, east of the Jordan River, a region known today for its rocky valleys and labyrinthine mountains. Now consider another piece of this puzzle. In Micah chapter 2, verse 12, God states, "I will surely gather all my people. I will bring them in like sheep of Bozrah." Bozrah was an ancient city located in Edom, south of Moab, known for its caves and natural cliffs. The word Bozrah means sheepfold, corral, place of protection. The image Micah creates is of a people surrounded by mountains like sheep, protected inside a gigantic enclosure. Wait a moment and observe this. Both Isaiah and Micah situate this prophetic refuge in areas that today correspond to the territory of modern-day Jordan. Furthermore, both use imagery of shelter, protection, isolation, and resistance. This is not a literary coincidence. It is a prophetic pattern. Now you might be thinking, but does this mean everyone should flee to that same literal location? Is that in fact the final destination of the flight described by Jesus? I'm not making definitive prophetic identifications. What I'm doing is noting that the prophets leave us geographical clues that strikingly coincide with regions known to be natural strongholds, difficult to invade, and historically associated with God's people in times of crisis. And here we enter an even deeper layer. When we look at Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, we find a startling statement about the Antichrist. He will stretch out his hand against several countries, but these will escape his hand: Edom, Moab, and most of the Ammonites. Let me explain what this means. Daniel is saying that during the period when the man of sin exercises world dominion, 3 specific regions will escape his control: Edom, Moab, and Ammon, all located in the desert east of Israel. This is perhaps one of the most overlooked clues in all of biblical prophecy. While the Antichrist extends his power over nations and peoples, 3 areas remain beyond his reach, and it is precisely these 3 areas that the prophets had already mentioned as possible places of protection. We are not talking about coincidence, but about prophetic consistency. Now, here's where it gets deeply specific. Edom, Moab, and Ammon are not random names. They are territories of reddish mountains, rocky plateaus, and narrow gorges. They are regions where entire cities have been carved into the rocks, where caves stretch for miles, where natural passages serve as nearly insurmountable barriers. It's an environment that can protect, conceal, and sustain. However, what makes this even more impressive is the fact that, according to Revelation chapter 12, this place is not only geographically capable, but spiritually prepared. That is, geography creates the setting, but divine providence creates the purpose. God takes a natural territory and transforms it into a supernatural refuge. Now you might be wondering, but why would God choose this particular region, so arid, so hostile, so isolated? Because this type of environment has always been part of God's method. He removes his people from confusion, idolatry, and pressure, and places them in a space where no other voice speaks louder than his. It was like that at Sinai, it was like that in the calling of Elijah, it was like that in the ministry of John the Baptist, and it will be like that again. Furthermore, it's not just any desert. The prophets describe mountains, caves, cliffs, and natural refuges. This points to a place formed not only by nature, but by divine sovereignty operating through it. The 5th discovery, therefore, is this. The Old Testament prophecies describe, with surprising consistency, a region east of Israel as a prophetic refuge. Whether this represents literal fulfillment or merely a prophetic pattern that God will repeat is something we cannot say for sure. But the alignment between Isaiah, Micah, Daniel, and Revelation is too profound to be ignored. And as we move toward Discovery 6, where we will examine not only the location, but also the mechanisms of divine protection during that period. We continue connecting the threads that Scripture itself has given us, without break, without pauses, like a prophetic narrative unfolding before us. As we move toward Discovery 6, we enter one of the deepest and, at the same time, least understood dimensions of all biblical prophecy, the way God protects His people when the whole world seems to crumble. So far, we have seen Jesus commanding flight, John describing a prepared place, and the prophets pointing to a region on the fringes of the Antichrist's dominion. But now we need to answer the question almost everyone silently asks. How exactly will God protect those in the wilderness while the beast's system controls everything around them? Let me explain what this means, because it is far more serious than we imagine. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 15, we read something profoundly symbolic and at the same time surprisingly literal. And the serpent spewed water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. Pay close attention to what happens next. In verse 16, John continues, "But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river which the dragon had spewed out." Now stop and reflect. The image is dramatic. The serpent, symbol of the enemy, unleashes a destructive current, whether literal or metaphorical, to try to reach the woman who fled. But the earth intervenes. Not an army, not technology, not a human strategy, but the earth itself. This leads us to Discovery 6. In the last days, God will not only use traditional methods of protection, He will use creation. Mountains, caves, rocks, crevices, geography itself, everything will be an instrument of His hand. You might be thinking, but is this literal? Will the earth really open its mouth to protect God's people? Valid point. But here's what you need to understand. This wouldn't be the first time creation has intervened on behalf of God's people. In Exodus, the sea opens and then closes. In Joshua chapter 10, the sun stands still. In Numbers chapter 16, the earth literally opens to consume Korah's rebellion. In Matthew chapter 27, the earth trembles when the veil is torn. It's no exaggeration to suggest that God will again use creation as an instrument of judgment and deliverance. And observe this. If the enemy unleashes a river, this indicates swift, merciless pursuit, like an overwhelming force aimed at catching those who have fled. This suggests surveillance, mobilization, drones, tracking, tools of pursuit that did not exist in John's time, but which make sense to us today. However, God promises that whatever the enemy uses to reach His people will be neutralized by the very terrain, as if the environment were in alliance with the Creator. Now let's go to an even deeper layer. In Daniel chapter 11, we see that the Antichrist will exercise fierce authority over vast regions, but Daniel lists exactly the areas that will escape: Edom, Moab, and Ammon. This is extraordinary. Not only does it confirm the pattern of refuge east of Israel, but it also indicates that something will prevent the Antichrist from exercising total control in these regions. Pay close attention to the prophetic logic. First, Jesus says to run away. Secondly, Jerome says there is a place prepared. Third, the prophets point geographically to a specific region. Fourth, Daniel states that this region escapes the dominion of the Antichrist. This forms a chain of protection, where divine order, geography, prophecy, and God's sovereignty converge. But here's what you need to understand. The protection will not only be external, it will also be spiritual. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 17, the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. This means that even outside the direct reach of the Antichrist, God's people will still be the target of the enemy's spiritual hatred. Therefore, divine protection in that prepared place will not only be physical security, but spiritual empowerment, manifest presence, emotional support, and supernaturally strengthened faith. And there is something even deeper here. The flight to the desert is not just escape, it is divine discipline. It is as if God were saying, "I will take you away from the noise so that you may hear my voice." While the world is consumed by the deception of the mark, those in the desert will be guarded from the mental, emotional, and spiritual influence of the beast. God not only preserves their bodies, He preserves their consciousness, their faith, their focus, their spiritual identity. Now you might be thinking, but how can I imagine living in such a hostile environment with such limited resources? Valid point. But remember, the desert was never the place where God showed weakness. It was always the place where God showed power. In Egypt, Israel saw judgment. In the desert, they saw daily miracles. In the modern world, we will see highly technological systems oppressing us. In the desert, we will see divine providence sustaining us. And there's more. The desert will be the stage where God will definitively break humanity's emotional dependence on structures. There will be no banks, no markets, no media, no electricity, no comfort. And it is precisely in this absence that God's presence will become more tangible. The desert has always been the place where God reveals Himself in His purest form. As we move toward Discovery 7, we will see how escape will not only be a practical command, but a spiritual call to trust God on a radical level. A call that demands decisions made before events unfold, so that when the moment arrives there will be no hesitation, doubt, or delay, but immediate obedience. Discovery 7 leads us to the most intimate and challenging point of this entire prophetic journey: inner preparation. Up to this point we have spoken of escape, geography, provision, divine protection, and the prepared place. But none of this will be possible, absolutely nothing, if the heart is not ready before the events begin. Escape doesn't begin with the legs, it begins with the decision. It begins in the spirit, it begins well before the abomination of desolation appears before the cameras of the world. Let me explain what this means, because it is profoundly transformative. Jesus never gave impossible commands, but He also never gave commands that could be obeyed without preparation. When He said flee, He knew that for many, this would be the most difficult decision of their lives. He knew it would mean leaving behind what defined a person's identity: home, routine, career, comfort, stability, loved ones. He knew it would be a radical break with everything we try to hold on to for security. So here is the truth that few dare to say: physical escape will only be possible for those who have already learned to escape spiritually from attachment to the things of this world. Without that, no one will be able to obey. Now observe carefully what Jesus says in Luke chapter 17, verse 32. Remember Lot's wife. Why would He bring up this particular person? Let me explain. Lot's wife was leaving the right city, in the right direction, at the right time. She was obeying, but her heart stayed behind. She looked back, and the act of looking revealed the inner truth. Her body was fleeing, but her soul was still clinging to what she was leaving behind. This is the hidden danger in Jesus' command. It is not enough to flee. One must flee completely, body, mind, and heart. Lot's wife respected the command with her feet, but disobeyed with her heart. And Jesus uses this story as a warning for the last days. Now you might be thinking, but how do I prepare my heart for something that hasn't happened yet? Valid point. But here's what you need to understand. All radical obedience in the Bible begins long before the moment of decision. When Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac, in Genesis chapter 22, that act didn't originate on Mount Moriah. It originated years earlier when Abraham learned to trust God by leaving leaving his relatives, waiting for a promised son when there was no hope. Small repeated acts of obedience built the faith for the great obedience. Similarly, if someone hopes to have the spiritual courage to flee at the most critical moment in history, they need to start now, with small daily calls to obedience. Here are 3 layers of spiritual preparation that emerge from biblical patterns. First layer, detachment. This doesn't mean abandoning your life, but putting everything in its proper place. Jesus didn't ask His disciples to abandon their homes permanently, but asked them to learn not to cling to them above Him. The flight at the end of times is merely the final expression of a lifestyle that already considers Christ greater than anything else. Second layer, spiritual discernment. Jesus made it clear in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, "Let the reader understand." This simple phrase carries a requirement: to know, to study, to meditate, to recognize. The Holy Spirit illuminates, but He illuminates what you know. Those who do not know the scriptures risk confusing signs, minimizing events, and rationalizing the critical moment. Discernment is born from the encounter between text and spirit. Third layer, practical faith. Not theoretical faith, not emotional faith, but faith that produces obedience when it seems irrational. In Hebrews chapter 11, we see a whole list of men and women who obeyed without seeing, without understanding everything, without having any guarantee of comfort. This faith is not built in crisis, it is tested in crisis. That is why it needs to be developed now. But there is something even deeper. The Great Tribulation will not only be a physical or political confrontation, it will be the greatest psychological and emotional confrontation in history. The whole world will be flooded with narratives, propaganda, speeches, announcements, signs, and images. The mental pressure will be immense. Those who are not firmly rooted in the Word may be led astray by fear, doubt, or human logic. That is why Jesus repeatedly says, "See that no one deceives you." And here's the part that almost no one notices. Even before the abomination of desolation, Jesus warns us that the love of many will grow cold. This cooling doesn't happen overnight. It begins with information overload, emotional exhaustion, the search for instant security, and the desire to control the future. Little by little, the heart gets used to depending on human structures, government systems, artificial stability, until living faith becomes just theory. Pay close attention. Those who learn to depend on the system now will hardly be able to break free from it when the system demands worship. Those who train their hearts to seek comfort above all else will hardly be able to obey when Christ's command is, "Leave everything and flee." And here comes the seventh discovery. True preparation for the Great Tribulation is not about stockpiling supplies, nor discovering escape routes, nor devising human strategies. It is about shaping the heart so that on the decisive day, it recognizes the voice of Jesus above all others. And this preparation happens in small daily acts, forgiving when it's difficult, honoring when no one is watching, obeying when it doesn't make sense, trust when everything is uncertain, to abandon sin when the world says it's normal, choose Christ when the flesh desires something else. The physical escape will happen in hours. Spiritual flight happens over the course of a lifetime. And it is this reality that naturally leads us to Discovery 8, where we will see how this inner preparation connects to the glorious return of the Son of Man and to the closing of this prophetic cycle in a coherent and transformative way. Discovery 8 leads us to the most profound conclusion of the entire prophetic narrative, not only what will happen in the world, but what will happen within those who choose to obey Jesus at the most decisive moment in history. Up to this point, we have seen the command to flee, the prepared place, divine protection, the prophetic region, creation cooperating, faith being shaped, but now we need to understand the ultimate purpose of all this, because none of Jesus' instructions exist merely for survival. Each instruction points to transformation, to spiritual preparation, to alignment with the coming kingdom. Let me explain what this means with all the necessary seriousness. The Great Tribulation is not merely a time of judgment, it is a time of definitive separation between two kingdoms. On one side, the human kingdom surrendered to the Antichrist. On the other side, the remnant surrendered to the Lamb. The flight into the wilderness is the transition between these two kingdoms. It is like crossing the Red Sea, a definitive break with the previous system, to enter into total dependence on God. Carefully observe what Jesus says in Luke chapter 21, verse 28. "When these things begin to happen, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." This phrase is more than encouragement, it is a spiritual diagnosis. Jesus is saying, when the world is afraid, you will be lifting your heads. When the system is crumbling, you will be looking up. Why? Because the desert is not the end, it is the corridor that precedes the arrival of the King. Now you might be thinking, but how can I endure years in the desert? How can I live without human guarantees? How can I remain emotionally strong? Valid point. But here's what you need to understand. The 1,260 days are not just days of protection, they are days of preparation. Just as Israel in the desert not only survived but was molded, shaped, and set apart, so too will the people who escape to the prepared place be formed for something greater than mere survival. The Word shows us that every desert experience in the Bible precedes a powerful manifestation of God. Noah went through isolation before seeing the rainbow. Moses went through a period of solitude before hearing the voice in the burning bush. Elijah went through famine before seeing the fire fall on Carmel. Jesus spent 40 days before beginning his ministry. The desert is not the absence of God, it is the laboratory where God reveals who he is. Now observe this, because it is profoundly prophetic. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, Jesus says, "Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky." John describes this moment in Revelation chapter 19. The heavens open, the Son of Man comes riding on a white horse, his eyes like a flame of fire, his garments sprinkled with blood. He does not come as the humble carpenter from Nazareth, he comes as King of Kings. And here is the point that connects everything. Those who are in the desert will not only survive the time of trouble, they will be alive to see the King return. That is why Jesus commands the flight. It is not cowardice. It is preservation for glory. It is deliverance to witness the climax of history. But here's what you need to understand. The Great Tribulation isn't just about the Antichrist. It's about Christ. It's not just about the beast's dominion. It's about the Lamb's final victory. It's not just about the wilderness, it's about the return. Now, allow me to anticipate a common question. But what if all this is just symbolic? What if the flight is only spiritual? What if the desert is just a metaphor? Valid point. Biblical prophecy often has layers. There are symbols that reveal profound spiritual realities. However, the same Jesus who said flee also described specific geopolitical signs. The same John who spoke of the dragon also described numbered days, physical locations, and literal peoples. Whether this moment represents the literal fulfillment or a remarkable preview of the prophetic pattern, every believer should, at the very least, observe, pray, and prepare. And this preparation is not alarmism. It is wisdom. It is spiritual maturity. It is consistency with the very posture that Jesus asked for. Watch. Now pay close attention to something that many forget. From the beginning, God has always prepared a people for the encounter with the King. In Egypt, he prepared Israel for the Exodus. In exile, he prepared Judah for the return. At Pentecost, he prepared the church for the mission. In the tribulation, he prepares the remnant for the return of the Lamb. Everything converges on this moment. The heavens open, the Son of Man descends, the kingdoms of the world become the kingdom of Christ. And those who fled, obeyed, persevered, and trusted will see this day with their own eyes, not as distant spectators, but as living witnesses to God's final triumph. Now you might be thinking, what do I do with all this today? And here's the point that concludes our journey. We're not talking about fear, we're talking about vigilance. We're not talking about panic, we're talking about preparation. We're not talking about speculation, we're talking about faithfulness. And so we conclude with 3 spiritual imperatives, not based on emotion but on the very teachings of Jesus. First, observe. Keep your eyes fixed on the scriptures and on events, especially those involving Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple. Prophecy says these are the main signs. Second, pray. Prayer is not escape, it is alignment. It is in prayer that the Spirit strengthens, directs, and prepares the heart to recognize the shepherd's voice above the noise of the world. Third, prepare yourself, not with alarmism, not with anxiety, but with faith. Prepare your mind with the Word. Prepare your heart with daily obedience. Prepare your spirit with continuous surrender. Whether this moment represents the fulfillment of prophecies or merely a powerful preview, the stance remains the same. Observe, pray, and prepare. Because when the Son of Man comes, and he will come, may he find you faithful, attentive, and ready to rejoice in the glory that is about to be revealed.